Hello everyone. My name is Jake Cecala, and I'm an ORISE postdoctoral fellow working with some people in the U.S. Forest Service. And I'm really excited to tell you about one of the projects I've been working on, which is a comprehensive literature review on the vulnerability of urban forests to climate change. Let's see. Before I start out, I want to acknowledge my postdoc mentors, Lara Roman and Natalie Van Dorn in the U.S. Forest Service, without whose guidance this would not be possible, as well as a group of urban tree researchers from around the globe that have worked with us to provide like continuous feedback on this project. So it's been really great working with this large group of people from around the world. So here's a brief outline for my talk. I'll be discussing the motivations for doing this review, the basic methods we used, the scope of the literature covered. I'll share some basic characteristics of the articles, and finally delve into like the frameworks and methodologies that sort of emerged from this body of literature. So why do a review on urban forests and climate change? As we know, urban forests are the principal providers of ecosystem services in cities, like heat and pollution mitigation, so on and so on. Um, but they themselves, the trees, are also susceptible to climate change as living organisms. And research on this topic has really expanded quite rapidly since the mid 2010s, with more studies being published every year in a wide diversity of disciplines. So, as no comprehensive reviews on this topic really existed, we wanted to provide a theoretical framework for future research. So here's how we went about this. So, to find pertinent peer-reviewed studies on this topic, we performed a standardized search in Web of Science and Scopus, and using the search terms that we determined beforehand. So as long as any paper contained at least one term from each of these colored boxes, it would show up in our search. And we also did a manual search of some arboricultural journals that are not regularly indexed in these, especially some older issues of these were not um, for relevant studies. So what did we find? Well, this process returned a quite staggering total of 14,000 articles, which if you're doing a literature review, I do not recommend starting with that many. But it's really thorough is the good news. So using a set of inclusion and exclusion guidelines seen here, we conducted a series of systematic screenings, first of titles and abstracts and then full texts, to narrow down the list only to those articles that fit our review criteria, which ended up being a final total of 177, so very refined. So what did we find? Um, what are the characteristics of this body of literature? Here's a histogram of the publication dates of these 177 articles. And really, as you can see, there's just been a major uptick in publications since the mid 2010s, and there's just more and more studies every year. We set a cutoff in early 2025 for this, so I'm sure there's been over 30 publications on this topic published this past year. So I need to get this out quickly, I think. Um, uh, so this is the when, but what about the where? Um, Here's a histogram of the countries in which the research was conducted in. So the big four in this topic area were the United States, China, Germany, and Australia. There were about 13 articles that actually collected data in multiple countries, which I pointed out right there. And then we have like five or fewer articles from each of these following countries. So a good diversity. But overall, many countries, especially in the global south, are very understudied, and their urban forests deserve further attention. So what if we break this down a little further? So here's a pie chart showing the breakdown of like the geographical scale of these studies. So whether they were conducting research in just one city in the article, multiple cities in the same country, or across several countries. So as you can see, about 2/3 of articles were focused on a single city in a single country, suggesting there's a need for multi-city and multi-country studies moving forward to sort of improve our understanding of this topic on a global scale. The next step was to extract information from these papers. This was the fun part. So in particular, I wanted to pay attention to the way in which studies approach the concept of climate vulnerability. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has defined vulnerability as the degree to which a system is unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. And it's represented as the conceptual intersection of three components, which is exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So what do these refer to? In the simplest terms, exposure is the magnitude of climate change experienced by a tree, which you quantify using climate data. Sensitivity is the degree to which a tree is affected by climate change, which is whatever variable you're going to be judging using whatever variable you're measuring about the tree in your study. And then adaptive capacity is the ability of a tree or society itself, which manages these trees, to adjust to the pressures of climate change. So I took note of what the authors did to approach each of these concepts. So what methods, measurements, and frameworks did they adopt to tackle each of these? And which did they address and which did they not? Because not every study looked at each one. And more importantly, how did this vary based on the methods employed? So I attempted to categorize these 177 studies based on their general methodological approach. I didn't have these categories beforehand, but they sort of emerged as I looked more at this body of literature as a whole. To answer the question, how are we as scientists and society in general approaching the question of urban tree climate vulnerability? I think this is really important. And generally, I found that studies fell into six non-mutually exclusive categories. Some studies used multiple of these approaches. And while I don't really have time to delve into like the intricate findings of each of these categories, I think it would be very interesting to share like the basic aims and goals of these different topics, as well as some of the caveats of each method, because no method is perfect, obviously. But the first of which is climate niche modeling. These studies typically leverage like occurrence data on trees in their native ranges, and then they use climate data from those native ranges while projecting future exposure to climate in the cities in which the trees are planted to study how different species of trees may fare in urban areas as climate change progresses. So these studies are really great for examining the vulnerability of entire urban forests, like at the city scale, but they're highly reliant on having accurate inventory data of cities. And they're subject to also the reliability of these climate models. And they often can overlook differences in microhabitats in cities, as well as management such as irrigation and other things which may allow trees to actually live outside of their native climate niches. So, if you like irrigate a tree more, that can sort of allow it to persist in a somewhat drier habitat than it evolved in. So stuff like that. The second category are what I'm calling these post-extreme weather event surveys. And these were really cool. Generally in these studies, after a major climate event, such as like a hurricane or a storm, researchers will survey trees in an area to determine the sensitivity of trees based on what species or like characteristics of trees are associated with damage or tree fall. So these studies provide like really great on the ground observational evidence, but many don't report like small scale differences in things like wind speed over the study area. So sometimes it can be hard to make like localized inferences about what caused damage to trees. The third category really stands out from the others, as its primary goal is collecting information from tree professionals and government documents regarding the vulnerability of trees to climate change. And I think these are really important. For example, these studies may survey arborists or other tree professionals about which trees they find in their experiences are most resilient to certain climate stressors, or they'll assess the capacity of cities and institutions to deal with managing urban forests in the face of climate change. So, like, do municipal tree management plans have like actions in place for climate change related topics and stuff like that? So, accordingly, these studies can provide really valuable insight into that institutional aspect of adaptive capacity. How well are human societies equipped to um, managing trees in the face of climate change? The fourth category includes studies that conducted dendrochronological analyses, which involve coring trees, going out in the fields, collecting tree cores, measuring the widths of rings to construct chronologies and correlating them with decades of past historical climate data to determine the sensitivity of trees to periods of drought and other past climate events. So these studies are really excellent for examining long-term responses of like individual trees, but they're often highly site-specific, as tree growth can be influenced by a lot of factors such as soil or like local impervious surface, things like that. Fifth, we have phenological monitoring studies, which I think are really cool. Similar to the previous group, they also use historical climate data going back many decades sometimes uh, to quantify exposure, but these focus on the relationship with the annual date of leaf out or flowering in trees. So what day of the year do trees first show their flowers or have their leaves? Yeah. So compared to dendrochronology, these studies can be actually pretty labor intensive as they require many sequential years of careful observation, and they often cannot account for other factors which might influence phenology, such as tree management, etc. Um, and lastly, we have a very broad grouping, which I won't go too in depth into. This was a lot of studies, though. I'm just referring to them as general physiological studies, which judge the sensitivity of trees based on a wide variety of different biological functions of the trees, like transpiration, water relations, photosynthesis rate, etc. It really, there's a huge diversity of methods here. And then linking them with weather data, which are typically measured locally with various kinds of technological devices. So that's really what I found so far. Before I finish, though, I just want to share some emergent themes for future research that have stood out to me so far in doing this review. I think there's a need to conduct studies incorporating multiple of these approaches to account for their respective weaknesses, which I think will overall result in more robust data and conclusions. Secondly, we should really prioritize collecting long-term, high-quality tree inventory data in different urban areas worldwide, which is often a limiting factor in research, and which can serve as the basis for numerous multiple future studies. And finally, there's a clear need for studies that span multiple countries or continents even, particularly in understudied regions like the Global South, to improve our understanding of urban forest vulnerability at the global scale. So thank you very much for listening. I'm hoping to submit this for review for publication pretty soon. So keep an eye out for it, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. Maybe to cities of the environment? I don't know.
Possibly.
Okay, so we have time for probably one question.
First of all, this is really cool. Thank you for all of your work on this. For phrenology, have you considered, with moving forward, and you did mention how labor intensive it is, have you considered trying to scrub social media for blooms, especially obviously the more charismatic blooms, people talk about them quite often, and that might be an avenue for gathering data.
Right. Yeah. So that's an excellent question. So for my review particularly, I was just limiting myself to peer-reviewed studies, but there were a handful of like really cool studies within each of these groupings that really stood out. There was one study, I think, from South Africa that looked at jacaranda trees, which are very iconic. We have those in LA. People love the flowers. They have them there too. But they had a great record of the flowering of jacaranda trees from local newspapers. And that's actually what they used as, instead of like firsthand observations, as a way to document the first flowering date of jacaranda going back many years. So that one was really cool. There are peer-reviewed studies out there that use those sort of like unconventional methods. But yeah, that's also a great idea for if you're doing primary research on this topic. Yeah.
Thank you,